Thank you all for coming tonight to our monthly Action for Canada meeting. My name is Chris Fraser. I'm the Ottawa chapter leader for Action for Canada, and I'm happy to have such a great crowd out tonight. And I know you could be at a lot of other places, but you're here. Technically, I should be over at the Canadian Tire Centre at the Michael Bublé concert, where I could be working, but I passed up Michael Bublé to be here with you folks. And of course with our guest speaker, John Robson. As we normally do at Action for Canada, I'm going to start off with a short prayer before we get going, since we are a Christian-based group. So just basically, thank you, Father. We are grateful for the freedom to gather and share ideas. We are thankful to live in a beautiful country and a world created by you. Although we don't have supreme control over the political, social, or physical climate, we will leave that in your mighty hands. Amen. So our speaker tonight is John Robson. You've already seen that from the emails I've sent you. John is the Executive Director of the Climate Discussion Nexus. Many of you know him as a National Post columnist and also a columnist with the Epoch Times. He has a BA and MA in history from the University of Toronto and a PhD in American history at the University of Texas. And John is here to talk to us tonight about climate change and rational debate. Climate change, rational debate. Please welcome John Robson.
Thank you very much, Chris, for the introduction and the invitation. Thank you all for coming out, especially given the conditions out there. Climate change is one of those things where a product may not be exactly as shown on package, obviously. And I want to talk about that, and I want to talk about it in a way that is at once sardonic and also to some extent hopeful, because my subtitle here is about rational debate, and do not despair. A number of you, I assume, will have seen this Amy Ham column about how Canada is broken and it's a good thing. And you might think that's a pretty bitter way of looking at it. But in point of fact, I find it encouraging in that so much is not working, and Canadians for so long didn't seem to notice that things weren't working, and that's a really bad situation. As Ham wrote in that column, Canadians are losing trust in major institutions, including Parliament and the school system. Good, because our institutions need an overhaul. Perhaps this country isn't a lost cause after all. And I do not think this country is a lost cause. As Adam Smith once said, there's a lot of ruin in a nation. But you certainly can't fix a problem until you admit you have it. And we have the problem that our institutions do not deserve our trust. They have systematically and insolently forfeited it on topic after topic, in part by refusing to engage in an adult conversation with us. And climate change, to me, is very much one of those topics. We have been bullied, we have been badgered, we have been patronized, we have been told things that are quite self-evidently not true. A typical case in point, the government puts out press release after press release about how the weather's getting worse. But we have pretty good statistics on a lot of the weather phenomena they're talking about, including, say, hurricanes. And they're not getting worse. Anybody can look this up, thank heavens for the internet. So again, you may also see this piece by Terry Corcoran about how the existential climate crisis is fading away. And he says, once billed as the threat that could destroy much of life on Earth, climate change driven by human consumption of fossil fuels has moved to the back burner of national and global policy making. Now, if true that in a way is bad news for me, I may have to find a new line of work, but climate change nevertheless is relevant in this regard because it's led to all these policy blunders carried out in a ham-fisted and sometimes almost iron-booted way, which is what squanders trust. And as Terry alludes to, in all kinds of countries, it's suddenly no longer a hot political issue. And the reason why is that ordinary people no longer believe in it. Not because they are fools, not because they are greedy, but because they have noticed that they were told children wouldn't know what snow is. And children aren't going to know how to get down the steps. There's so much of that stuff. And so there's a line I use quite frequently from Jay Budachevsky. This was on a very different topic, but it covers a lot of subjects, including this one. In his book, The Revenge of Conscience, he talked about how euthanasia was going to go from being allowed to being required. And then he wrote this passage. No, the progression is too extreme, someone will protest. People are not that logical. Ah, but they are more logical than they know. They are only logical slowly. And, if people were not logical, self-government would be a pathetic failed experiment. It wouldn't have lasted as long as it has in the English-speaking world, going back to Magna Carta, and it wouldn't have triumphed over all these other systems that seem to get out of the gate faster and then sprint in the wrong direction. If it were logical faster, Winston Churchill would not have made his famous remark that many forms of government have been tried and will be tried in this world of sin and woe. No one pretends that democracy is perfect or all-wise. Indeed, it has been said that democracy is the worst form of government, except for all those other forms that have been tried from time to time. Now, in this world of sin and woe, you have to check whether people really said things that they've been credited with saying, so I did check, and he really did say that. And of course, in this world of sin and woe, we are flawed. We are flawed from top to bottom, front to back, from body to mind, and this is why people are not logical more quickly or more exactly. But it's also a world that is not a lost cause, and neither is self-government, and neither is Canada. Now, in case you don't know a lot about the climate discussion nexus, which I'm not going to mention wasn't on your list of resources for climate, lest it seem invidious, we were started back in 2018 by a bunch of citizens concerned about expensive, ill-planned energy policies intended to reduce carbon dioxide emissions. And it came out of my 2017 documentary, which some of you may have helped to fund. And if you did, I thank you very much, because not only did the documentary appear, it also led to the Climate Discussion Nexus. And so I'm very grateful to you. When we started the thing, we were going to put out a newsletter and make the occasional video, and we did that to an enormous wave of public indifference. And then, in January of 2020, we went viral. And I don't know how well you can see that, but here's our flat line, and then suddenly, kaboom! We went from a few dozen views a day to a spike that peaked at almost 80,000 views in a single day. Yes, thank you. And this, to me, confirmed a number of my more hopeful assumptions, that if you speak about a subject intelligently and you don't lose your sense of humor, sooner or later, people are going to get drawn into the discussion in a way that is positive. And I believe that we have helped to demonstrate that this is true. And although we have not, of course, had 80,000 views a day, you can't have everything, and if you did, where would you put it? Despite the peaks and valleys, we have never gone back to the obscurity in which we languished. And I think we're going to probably be at 17 million views by this weekend, which... Thank you. To the astonishment of my children, who regard me as the least cool person in the world, partly because I'm their dad, and partly because I am the least cool person in the world. So if I can be a successful YouTuber, it appears that it isn't done the way that the influencers will tell you it is done. Including, and to me this is illustrative, the video that caused the breakthrough. We actually made it back in May of 2019, and then 7 months later, it achieved liftoff, was a refutation of this notion that 97% of scientists, or climate scientists, or world scientists, it was never even all that clear, believe there's an urgent man-made climate crisis. And Barack Obama tweeted about it, and Barack Obama altogether please, is not a climate scientist. But what is interesting is that the video is over 16 minutes long, and what it does is it pries into the surveys and talks about the methodology. What were the questions? What did they do with the sample? How did they skew their results? And if you wanted to have 17 million YouTube views, you might be told, don't do a video on statistics. But of course, the world is a big place, and all kinds of people have all kinds of interests and hobbies. And you can find a video online of a saxophone museum that has saxophones from the tiny to ones that are stick floor models. And you can find a lot of people who care a great deal about whether or not that claim is true. Because if it is true that 97% of scientists say there's an urgent man-made climate crisis, you'd have to be something of a fool to challenge it. But if you're told that by people who don't know what they're talking about, you'd have to be something of a fool to believe the other things they say. And this, of course, is a very rational process. You know, and this was a very irresponsible thing to say, but of course Barack Obama was very popular with a lot of people, and so when he said it, they assumed that he knew what he was talking about. And again, you can say various things about that, but let us concede that there are reasons why people support political parties we don't support. There are reasons why people like politicians we do not like, and so it takes a while for a realization to spread that there was something fishy about that number. And I could go on, or I could just give Tom the microphone, and, you know, the idea that science is done by consensus, all these kinds of things. But it does take a while to get there. And by the way, YouTube limited ads on that video. It's one of the interesting things that's happened to us. They've limited ads on 4 of our 7 most popular videos, which feels like a conspiracy, but it's probably just people there who don't like our point of view. But it hasn't stopped people from watching it. I think that the line is that it's not suitable for all advertisers, but that's a bit silly, since it seems to me to stand to reason that the million people who watched the video probably liked its contents, and therefore if you advertise there, they would think, you're our kind of advertiser. But you know, I don't run YouTube and they don't run CDN, so that's life. But if you look at what's happening in the climate debate now, and you look at what some of the alarmists are saying, they're going, oh, it's terrible. People are less agitated by this. Climate policy's falling apart. Alternative energy had a bad year. Boo, Trump, the orange climate demon. But, you know, and there are, you know, I'm not a Donald Trump fan. You may all shuffle away from me there on the bench, but some of you will presumably know that I'm not. But it's not as though Donald Trump suddenly acquired enormous magical powers. He found Sauron's ring and used it to destroy climate policy. Donald Trump got elected by people who were fed up with the alternatives. And my view is that Trump is the wrong answer, but to the right questions. And at any event, I hope we can agree on the questions, right? And realize that around the world, people are asking logical questions, and they're getting to logical answers eventually. I mean, one of my questions for Trump's more acerbic critics is, if he's as bad as you say, why is he better than the other parties? And that really, I mean, that's a serious question. How could he have the flaws you point to, and yet he'd make a better president than Kamala Harris or Joe Biden? So, I don't want to get too far afield, but the point is that people are logical. They are logical slowly, and I think a lot of people in the United States are fed up. I mean, if you look at the last 3 presidential elections, we think about the Democratic Party. It's got, you know, hundreds of members of Congress. It has dozens of governors. It has thousands of state legislators. And the 3 best candidates they could find were Hillary Clinton, Joe Biden, and Kamala Harris. The Republican Party, ditto, has all this talent, dedicated, knowledgeable people, and the best 3 candidates they could find were Donald Trump, and Donald Trump. There might be reasons why people feel that they are being insulted by both parties. And of course here in Canada, similar remarks could be made. And will be. That's the important point. People take it for so long that you start to think, what is wrong with you clowns? And by the way, it's somewhere in How to Win Friends and Influence People. He says, if you start out, you're an idiot because you don't tend to persuade people. So you have to kind of go, I'm not going to say that. What shall I say? But one of the things that you can say is, people do care. And if people are logical too slowly, remember, here's the thing you don't often hear about democracies. Gee, the public mood is not sufficiently volatile. Right? So if you wish, I wish the public mood were more volatile. I wish people were more irritated, more agitated, more prone to change their views in a hurry. So, really? Are you sure about that? It's like my point, it frustrates me that everybody doesn't agree with me the minute they hear my opinion. But if the world were that kind of a place, it might happen, only it would be somebody else's opinion. So, okay, be logical slowly, even when I tell you how things are and how they should be. Given that, climate alarmism swept the field rather quickly back in the day. Back in the 1980s, a bunch of people started saying, the planet is heating, carbon dioxide is causing it to heat, we're causing the carbon dioxide, this is going to run away and it's going to kill us all. And the fact that the people who talk this way were often, in some clear sense, hypocrites. And you look at Justin Trudeau lecturing us about carbon footprints. There was something galling about that. But even if he had been a self-indulgent, travel-happy, spoiled rich kid or something along those lines, he could still have been right about the science. And it wouldn't have done us much good to say, yeah, well, you fly a lot, if in fact our planet had burned up. We'd have been, okay, maybe we should have listened to the warning and forgotten that the messenger was like Al Gore, a little bit hard to take in terms of his own personal life. Or Mark Carney, right? Mark Carney seems to be more at home in an airplane than in his office by a long shot. And of course, sometimes when people complain, people used to complain, liberals complained about George Bush Jr., he took too many vacations. And I was like, oh yeah, and you like what he does when he goes to work? I mean, come on, you should be inviting him out to the golf course. But the fact is that people made predictions that convinced people for a long time, but didn't and couldn't convince them permanently because they weren't right. Now, I mentioned these press releases. This is one that just came out about how to adapt and prepare for the weather conditions that we can expect with our changing climate, including extreme precipitation. And there's a proposition in there. Extreme precipitation is getting worse. But there's also a lot of people out there in the world gathering data, and not all of them are fudging it. You have to be careful. Some people are incompetent, other people are seeing what they expect to see, but by and large, we do have the knowledge. And also because the government says, oh, we're all being, hammered by climate change, our houses are being set on fire, washed away, and so forth. And people look at their house and go, actually, still there, right? And they do notice, and at some point they stop believing things. And again, you remember Bill Gates, right? Bill Gates used to be one of the worst offenders in this regard, in that he, one of these guys saying, oh, the seas are rising, and he has a mansion by the ocean. But recently, he shocked and appalled people by saying, you know what, mankind has a lot of worse problems than climate change, like poverty, malaria, and he proceeded to list a bunch of things that are legitimate problems and someone should do something about them, especially if they're massively rich and have a foundation. And he is trying to do something about them. I'm not taking the mickey out of Bill Gates here, but it's interesting that a lot of people are something like, well, he's just a software engineer, who cares about him? It's like, well, you 3 days ago, come off it. And people notice that too. They notice if you're suddenly against somebody, not because you say his opinion is wrong on this point, but because you say nobody ever should have listened to him when you were listening to him. People notice this. It does have an impact. And in Corcoran's column, he quotes an environmental academic named Christian Dunn, who is in fact still pretty much an alarmist, but he says this hard truth. Those of us who work on environmental issues have helped to create the problem. Because, he said, for years we have led with catastrophe. We have told people that saving the planet means giving things up. Cheaper food, warm homes, family holidays abroad, cars, and choice. We have moralized, shamed, fined, taxed, and scolded. And then we have acted surprised when large sections of the public decided they want no part of it. Now, what's interesting about that is that Dunn hasn't changed his mind even slightly on the substance of the issue. He just thinks they had a bad PR strategy, saying giving up everything you value is going to be wretched. And he wants to find a perky way of saying that. And, that's not going to work. any more than too many people in the Canadian oil industry and energy industry have this slogan about how Canadian oil is the least bad, right? And we should therefore be allowed to sell it for now. And I have said to some of them that our product destroys the planet, get yours today, is the worst marketing slogan conceivable. Not just the worst one anybody ever adopted, the worst one they could adopt. I'd do better PR for them than that, and I'm not exactly in that business, am I? But indeed, Dunn says that people balk at being told the solution is a lifetime of hair shirt misery. This requires a change in tone from negative to positive. We have to stop thinking like environmental scientists and instead think more like advertising executives. Instead of selling environmental action as sacrifice, we should sell it as improvement. Which, in a funny way, they actually have been doing, right? This green energy transition was meant to make us all live like those videos in the Epcot Center. The problem is, they need to start thinking like environmental scientists. They need to start thinking about error bars, uncertainties, defects in the measurements, predictions that were excessive, models that are chronically overheated. And they need to go clean with us, because if your life does not get better because gasoline is more expensive, there's no ad campaign that can make you happy about it. He's got it completely wrong. People are not believing that our lives are going to be ruined if it gets ever so slightly warmer. They're not believing that a little bit more carbon dioxide in the atmosphere is going to melt the polar ice caps. They don't believe the weather is getting worse. I mean, some do. I'm not saying everybody, but the public mood is shifting because people are logical, slowly but relentlessly. You know, if fixing the crisis requires a lifetime of hair shirt style misery, there's no positive way to spin it, right? Brightly colored hair shirts scratch just as badly. But the point is that people no longer believe, by and large, en masse, in Western democracies, that it does require that. And in fact, for years, if pollsters ask people, should we do something about the climate crisis, they say yes. And if you then say, would you spend $5 a month to stop it, they say no. Well, that tells you a good deal about what they think. What tells you a lot more than what they say is what they do, right? Anybody can say, yeah, sure, I'd spend $1 million, but ask them to spend another 40 cents on a liter of gasoline, and you find out what they really think. And the problem that the alarmists have, and the hope that I have, is that this entire theory about what drives temperature in the world generally, and what has driven temperature in the last 50 years, and what happens if it gets warmer, the whole theory is wrong. And because the theory is wrong, its prescriptions are wrong, and so are its predictions. And in fact, back in June of last year, we released a video that might have seemed fatuously optimistic, which is not a quality I think is often associated with me. Fatuous, yes. Optimistic, no. And it was called The End of Alarmism. And again, how to win friends and influence people online. It was a look at the history and philosophy of science. Now, Thomas Kuhn's book, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, changed my life when I was an undergraduate, which gives you a kind of a sad perspective on my life pre and post. But again, we went into this question, how do scientific theories get started? What makes people believe them? What attracts a new generation of researchers to a new paradigm? You use a paradigmatic word. And then, what causes theories to wither and die? And my assessment of that video was that it actually was convincing in the 80s. Researchers thought they found something marvelously exciting intellectually and scary as all get out practically, and they threw themselves into it because in the latter part of the 20th century, atmospheric CO2 was going up, and so apparently was temperature. Well, gee, coincidence or causation? But then, of course, what they started trying to do was find other examples of CO2 driving temperature, and they couldn't do it. That's why they loved it when Michael Mann killed the medieval warm period. Because the medieval warm period was very clearly not caused by rising atmospheric CO2. Now, Michael Mann's research has since come under hostile scrutiny for a good reason, but they had to do this. It was a logical kind of scientific research program, not some kind of scam or hoax. But it didn't work. They couldn't get rid of the Holocene climatic optimum. They couldn't deal with the fact that previous interglacials were warmer than today with lower atmospheric CO2. The science fell apart. And so the theory is coming apart at the seams. Everybody, from the person in the street to the academic, is seeing that this thing is increasingly held together with baling wire. I mean, if you've actually read Kuhn's book, and he talks about Ptolemaic astronomy and the theory that all astronomical motion is circular. And when you run into motion that's not circular, what you do is you say, well, it circles within circles. And a competent mathematician can make a circle within a circle to an oval or all kinds of things. But at some point, you're just getting this ludicrous profusion of circles, and it breaks down faster than you can patch it. And at some point, the theory becomes a monster. And the theory of man-made CO2-driven global warming has become a monster. And because people are logical, it's not going to survive this fact. And I bring this up because I'm not just talking about climate change here. I mean, we have a kind of poly-crisis, as the alarmists like to say, in Canadian public policy. When you think of how many things are wrong, and by the way, apropos of optimism, I'm not an optimist. Optimism is a psychological condition and a fatuous one. I'm hopeful, and hope is a theological virtue. And we should be hopeful, even while assessing the situation dispassionately. And, you know, it's hard sometimes, because politicians talk such babble that it's an Augean task to figure out if they're fools, knaves, or both. Really, some of them, and you're thinking, please tell me that there's some cunning plan inside their head, and they talk like this so we won't figure out what it is, but unfortunately, no. What's inside their head came out their mouth, and that's all they've got. There's nothing else in there. And that is quite sad. But, of course, with the rise of alternative media, you get a lot of stuff that really should be stamped on. You know, sometimes when people post something particularly vile, I want to say, does your mother know that you put such things online? And then I think, maybe I better not see their mother's feed, right? This could be the good stuff. But there are more and more venues for challenging the orthodoxy. More, and in this contest between vile nonsense and hopeful good sense, the hopeful good sense will eventually prevail. It may be the tortoise, but the tortoise wins the race. And, you know, I have a Herman cartoon that I keep on my desk of a guy, he's in the Pony Express, and he's leaning over his boss's desk with a series of arrows sticking out his back, and the boss is going, no one said the job would be easy. So, you know, I'm not promising that the job will be easy. But as Theodore Roosevelt said, life has no greater prize to offer than hard work worth doing. And we got a bunch of it. You know, elections don't go the way we want. Often the party that we wanted to win loses, and often we shouldn't even have wanted that party to win, to be blunt. Policies are a horrendous mess in this country, from fiscal to foreign policy to social to environmental. And a lot of times the opposition parties are as useful as a square wheel. I mean, it's no good thinking, oh, if only the blue ties were in power, because they've been in power, and they didn't fix much of anything. Or even this was Christopher Dummett in the Post. Toronto's now infamous Eglinton Crosstown. Toronto's taken longer to build and open 19-kilometer light rail line than McDonald's Canada took to build nearly 3,500 kilometers of transcontinental railway across rugged terrain and mountains. Build Canada indeed. Right? And the worst part of that, in some ways, is the rhetoric about building Canada is believed by so many people when we can't build a subway. And you think of the technology that McDonald's age had available, and you think of what we've got. So there are all kinds of problems. I don't have to remind people in this room, but I will, that we still haven't had a proper examination of the government's response to COVID. I mean, we can all get into high dudgeon, and we should, but the government does need a plan for dealing with pandemics, and it's a plan that needs to be based in good science, good economics, and good policy. Whatever happened 5 and a bit years ago, it sure wasn't that. And we've never asked ourselves why not, meaning the next one will almost certainly be handled even more stupidly, and that is a scary prospect. One of the things about this, I remember back then, people keep asking me, are you vaccinated? And my smart aleck response was, against what? Because, of course, I'm vaccinated against a host of terrible diseases, right? Like polio, Hib, whooping cough, my goodness, dreadful things that kill you, paralyze you. It's like, you really shouldn't let me into a public place if I'm not vaccinated against these things. So which of those did you have in mind? And then, never mind that, right? Polio, schmolio. But if you don't have that COVID vaccine, you're not eating here. And even like that ought in retrospect to be thought as very silly. And I'll mention in this context that when I was going to Senegal last year, and so Senegal is, among other things, cursed by a lot of diseases. It's a very, very unhealthy place. So I thought, oh, well, no problem. I've got all these vaccines. So then I went to my doctor and I said, well, I'm vaccinated against this, this, and this when I was a kid. And the doctor said, actually, that stuff wears off. Okay, didn't know that. Now it works. I went and got it all again. I got about 50 vaccines in 2 weeks. I'm amazed I survived that process. But, you know, vaccines are crucially important and they protect against a lot of bad diseases. But the government traded on that to make us do dumb stuff with a vaccine that didn't really work. Remember, if you get the vaccine, you won't get the disease. And people who got the vaccine were going to boast that they got COVID anyway. I don't know why that was a status symbol, but it was. And they made us wear these masks. My retort on these cloth masks was, ask your doctor if they'd go into an operating room with one of these on. You know, if we need real medical grade masks, make us wear medical grade masks. But putting a handkerchief over your mouth, like we laugh at the things people did to try and stop the Black Death, well, if we got out with these masks, we wouldn't have lasted long then either. And I mean, we've got the Prime Minister, you know, going off to communist China and saying, oh, we're into the New World Order with these guys and there's a strategic partnership and so on. You're thinking, you know, really, have we learned nothing? Like, have we actually learned nothing? Should we just fold up the voting booths and hope that heredity gives us a good king, right? Bring back Edward the First or something along those lines. But, you know, again, don't give up. And there's another one. There was a piece in the National Post. I've been praising the Post. I'm not praising this story. It was to do with Trump and Denmark and Arctic sovereignty. And it said, in addition to the increasing defense spending to 5% of GDP by 2035, the federal government has recently announced blah, blah, blah. So the story took as fact something Mark Carney promised to do 10 years from now that they have no idea how to do. And by the time that story appeared, his promise to get to 2% by the end of last year was already revealed to be hollow, not deceptive. He wasn't telling a deliberate lie. He said something that sounded good and felt good, but he didn't know how to do it, and when he tried, he didn't try the right way, and it would have been easy to do anyway, and it didn't happen. So why doesn't the news story say, in addition to an absolutely preposterous promise that no sane person would believe? So there's a lot to do even with the good newspapers, and the Post is a good newspaper. But on the plus side, crime's out of control. And the reason that's the plus side is because people know it. The government is talking down to us, they're patronizing us, the parole system is way too lax, judges make silly rulings, but the public isn't buying it anymore. And again, not everybody, right? There's people who hold views that are unbelievably silly sounding even after I tell them mine. But people know the criminal justice system is not working properly, and they understand this critical point that you can be as sympathetic as you like to the perpetrator, but if you let them out, they're going to victimize somebody who didn't deserve it. And so people are being logical about this. People know the system is broken, and increasingly they say the system is broken. And in a country like Canada, what that means is it's going to get fixed. It's not going to get fixed perfectly, right? Until the second coming, nothing in human affairs is going to be perfect, and it's no point in asking for it to be perfect. But that doesn't mean you give up either. And it doesn't mean you give up on public debate, and it doesn't mean you give up on approaching public debate, you know, fortiter re suaviter in modo, right? Firm on the substance, but pleasant insofar as possible in manner. And above all, don't lose your sense of humor, right? You've got to say it with a smile. You've got to be happy warriors. We have got to understand that in some fundamental theological sense, the battle is already won, and we're on the winning side. And that doesn't mean we're not going to die on the front lines, right? But it does mean that in a very real way, especially with a Christian organization, right? We know the battle is won. Now let's get the victory in the right spirit. And the right spirit including on climate, where people no longer believe the horror stories in sufficient numbers for this policy to continue, is that we stay sane, we stay cheerful, and we stay on the side of truth. And if we do that on climate, on crime, on budgets, on foreign policy, on this whole host of issues that have us agitated and tempted sometimes to start growling rude words in public, then we can and we will turn it around. So believe that public debate is logical slowly. And the slowly is aggravating, but the logical is extremely encouraging. And let us all be encouraged.